Hello and welcome to another Friday free-for-all here on Agency Leadership TV. I'm Chip Griffin, and we've got a whole lot of topics on tap today to talk about that hopefully will help you to run your PR and marketing agency better and learn from the experiences of others. I've got a giant pile of questions that have come up in the Spin Sucks community Slack channel, the Agency Leadership Slack channel, individual coaching sessions that I've had with clients in the last couple of weeks. So let's start diving right into it here in just a moment. But first, just a reminder, if you weren't with me earlier this week, I had a very popular live session on agency pricing. If you didn't have a chance to watch it live and haven't watched the replay yet, be sure to visit agencyleadership.tv to check out that recording as well as recordings of most of these live sessions and some pre-prepared videos as well. The video content is growing by the day, and hopefully it is helping you out and giving you ideas for what you can do in your own business. Next week, we've got live episodes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We will have a session on Friday, even though it is July 3rd and a holiday. We'll keep it light and probably on the brief side, depending on what you all have for questions, which, of course, is a good reminder. If you do have questions, be sure to type them in, whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, put them in the comments. And if we're live while I'm getting those comments in, I will be sure to try to address them during the course of this session. So with that, let's jump into the first question that came up, and this was in a coaching session. And the question was this: I've been recording a few video presentations and doing live presentations recently. I'm wondering how I can maximize these, even though some contain very specific audience information. And so I think this is a great place to start, particularly as we're doing video here. And so if you are, like many people, producing webinars or those kinds of things, be sure that you're recording them. If you're doing them for your own audiences, of course, you're free to share them. If you're doing them on behalf of other organizations or in partnership with other organizations, those can be very valuable content as well. You need to start by asking them if they are comfortable with you sharing all or part of those recordings. And some of that will depend upon the ground rules that they've set with their own audiences and perhaps whether they're charging for access, what they plan to do with the recording themselves. So there's a lot of different things that you'll want to check if it's in partnership with another organization. But even if you can't use the full video, or perhaps in addition to the full video, you should look at using individual snippets and creating shorter videos. So for example, LinkedIn loves video content. And if you are trying to raise your own profile as a thought leader, if you're trying to raise the profile of your agency, sharing video out to your own channels can be a very effective way to do that. And so if you cut up little bits of your webinar presentation or other video trainings or things that you're doing, and you cut them down into 3, 5, 7-minute segments, those can be fantastic to upload directly to LinkedIn. And it's important to know that you want to upload them directly to the platform as opposed to simply linking over to YouTube or Vimeo or one of those platforms, because LinkedIn very much appreciates having the content hosted on their own site. Same with Facebook. Even if you're posting videos to YouTube directly, for example, you may want to upload them directly to Facebook as well, because the algorithm is typically more likely to show you or show your content to users if you have put the content in their native format. So you can find a lot of different ways to use that video. The other thing to think about with the video content that you're creating is it doesn't have to necessarily be sent out in a mass marketing type format. You don't necessarily need to post it to your website or YouTube channel or those kinds of things. You can actually use them in very targeted ways to initiate conversations with prospects, reignite conversations, maybe prod someone along. And so you want to think about how you might leverage some of that content. So let's take a real world example. If you've been working with a prospective client and you've talked to them about some ideas and they owe you a response and you weren't able to set up a specific follow-up time, well, that's always best practice if you can. Every time you finish a conversation, try to get a new time set. But let's say you didn't. A way that you can nudge someone along without saying, hey, have you had a chance to think about this, or do you have any thoughts on my proposal? You can say, hey, I recently did this presentation. I thought it might interest you because, and use it as a jumping off point to reignite the conversation that you had been having with them about how your agency might be able to help them. And so in that conversation, you're now providing value to your prospect, and it's not simply a sales outreach. So it's, first of all, more comfortable for you in many cases, because I know many of you as agency owners don't like selling. It's not what you're passionate about. You know, you have to do it because that's the only way to keep your agency sustainable and to help it to grow. But if you're able to provide that educational content, it's easier for you. But it's also oftentimes more warmly received by the recipient because they see it as you providing them some value added at no additional expense. So lots of different ways that you can use the video. Think about it as how you can use it in whole, in part, one-on-one, to large groups, maybe to your email list. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So think really creatively about it, because you don't ever want to limit yourself to just creating that presentation once if you can avoid it. And if you can take it and make it into a force multiplier by cutting it up, maybe you use a transcript someplace, maybe you turn it into a blog post, maybe you turn it into an article that you put on LinkedIn or Medium. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So really try to think creatively about how you can build off of that video content as a foundation for future efforts. So hopefully that helps to answer that question that came up. The next one, this is a contracts question. And I know on Fridays we love to talk about accounting and legal issues and those kinds of things, but it really goes to new business. So I thought this was a good one to bring up. And this is someone who has a master services agreement that makes it clear that the payments made by clients are non-refundable. And recently this agency owner has had some clients pushing back against this and saying, hey, I think that the fees should be refundable. There should be some way for us to exit beyond the 30 or 60-day notice that we can provide. And the owner did say in this post that they do have a 30 or 60-day out in all of their contracts, but what they do is they charge in advance. And so this is clients who are looking perhaps to have the contract say that they can get funds refunded. And I think it's also important to understand that this particular arrangement is for a 12-month project. So not necessarily a project in the traditional sense where you're building off specific assets. You're doing 3 press releases, or you're building a website or a logo. So it's not as well defined as that. It's more a 12-month plan that you then break up into 12 monthly installment payments. And so if we sort of look at this at a 30,000-foot level, how do you deal with clients who want refunds? How do you deal with contracts to make sure that you're protecting yourself while at the same time being fair to your clients? And how do you deal with pushback against terms that say it's non-refundable, but frankly, any other contract term? So lots of things to unpack here, so let's start diving in. The first thing I would say is when you think about your contracts, you need to think about them in terms of a couple of different things. The first is you need to think about it as that foundational legal document. You do want to make sure that it's protecting your interests, and so you absolutely want to work with your legal counsel to figure out, what are the terms that you want to have so that you are protected, that you get fairly compensated, and that you have recourse for clients who may not abide by the terms of the agreement. So let's accept as a foundational premise that you have to have those kinds of protections in there. That said, you also need to look at your contract as one of the first documents that you are exchanging with your new client. And so you need to look at your agreements in the frame of light, in the frame of reference that your clients will be looking at it. So you need to say, if I received this document, how would I feel? And we've all looked at contracts, I'm sure, over the years where we said, oh my God, I cannot believe these terms. They're sort of in-your-face onerous. So you do need to think about how it's going to be perceived. And there are ways to protect your interests and work with your lawyer to make sure that they are, but at the same time, put things in sort of a more user-friendly, people person kind of way in the document so that it doesn't come out as glaringly objectionable to someone who is reading it. And it's a fine line to walk, because lawyers always want you to be as explicit as possible and as, sort of in your face as possible with terms, because that's the easiest way to defend them whenever there's a disagreement. At the same time, you want to make sure that you are not compromising your negotiation from the get-go, compromising your relationship with the client from the get-go based on those legal terms and the way that you have written them. Okay, so the next thing that you need to think about is what are you actually willing to enforce? And I think this is really important. And as someone who has created multiple contracts, many contracts over the years, signed many contracts, had many contract disputes, for better or for worse, over the years, I know that there are all sorts of occasions where you'll have to go back to these documents. But you need to ask yourself, how much are you willing to fight and what are you willing to fight over? So, a lot of times, contracts between agencies and clients are really simply a leverage point. It's a way to begin to resolve an issue that comes up. At the same time, I think many agencies have found, particularly in the last few months, that the contracts that they have with clients only amount to so much on paper, because if the worst comes to happen, economically, or for that individual client, or for your individual relationship with the client, the contract itself is going to be something that you may use as a jumping off point for your conversation, but it's not as ironclad as it may seem. Even if the document says you can't get out of this agreement early, a lot of times clients may simply say, I'm not going to pay. And in most cases, it's not going to be worth it for you to take that client to court. Now, I know cases where agencies have taken clients to court, even if it is not necessarily a huge financial return for them or even a positive financial return. They're simply trying to make the point that they believe that their clients need to uphold their agreements. And believe me, I am someone who believes if you sign a contract, you have an obligation and you should be fulfilling it on whichever side of that agreement you might be. But at the same time, a realistic approach is that there are many things that you are not going to go to court over. And you have to decide what it is that you're willing to fight over, because if you're not willing to fight over it, if that term is violated, then you don't want to start a fight over it during the initial negotiation, because you're simply creating sour feelings that you will never end up using in the end. Okay, but let's take a look at this, because you do want to make sure that you're not in a position in 99.9% of the cases to ever be refunding money to a client. And that is an area that I think it is important for most agencies to draw the line on, because it's one thing not to get paid for something, that's bad enough. But if you've already had money in your account and you're now being asked to pay it back to a client, that's all. It's first of all, it's damaging to you from a cash flow perspective, but it usually signals that something has gone woefully wrong with that arrangement, with that partnership, with that relationship. So you want to avoid that at all costs. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable. And throughout the course of all of my businesses over the last 25 years or so, I don't think I have ever, that I can recall, ever had to actually refund money to a client. And there have been plenty of times where the terms have been set up so that I have been paid in advance. And so you want to be thinking about, how do you avoid that? And there's a few different ways that you can avoid that, both in the terms of the agreement and in the way that you're working with your clients, because it's that important. And when it comes to this, you want to make sure that you're starting out with clear expectations on both sides. And that means expectations about the work that's going to be done, but also expectations about why your payment terms are what they are. So in this particular case, where the agency is charging in advance rather than in arrears for their work. So in other words, you owe me January's payment by January 1 as opposed to sometime in February. If you're going to be set up that way, which is a great way to be set up from a cash flow perspective, and it's the smartest way if you can get your clients to agree to it, to do things. If you're going to do that, then you need to make sure that they understand that there is a reason why they are paying in advance. And typically, for example, when I've done that, I've typically presented it in terms where here is your price if you pay in advance, and here is your price if you pay in arrears, so they understand that they're getting a significant benefit by accelerating their payment. And this goes back to something I talked about in the pricing episode earlier this week. You can use your terms to make adjustments to your pricing relationship with your clients. And so if you are doing that, and if you are convincing them to pay in advance instead of in arrears, it's really good for them to understand that there's value in it. And so as a result, because they're getting effectively a discount for doing that, it makes it so that you cannot be refunding it, because otherwise you're now taking on all of the risk and deferring any of their risk. And that just doesn't make any sense. And you wouldn't want to have a negotiation that went forward that way. Now, you can also take your relationship with the client and take a look at it and say, okay, if a client is coming to me asking for a refund after they've already signed the agreement, Why are they doing this? What does that mean? And typically, in cases where I have seen clients come to me and ask for refunds, it's usually because the relationship has gone off the rails, and that's because of the expectations, not on the financial side, but on the business side. What are we delivering? How are we delivering it? What results will they get? And so those are things you want to make sure you're crystal clear on in advance. And at the earliest sign of challenge, you're dealing with it. Because once someone comes to you and asks for a refund, it generally means that your relationship is irreparable. It is very rare for someone to come to you asking for a refund and then being in a position where you can salvage that relationship. It's not impossible. I think I've probably done it a couple of times over the course of my career, particularly when I was running the software as a service business, Custom Scoop, but it is something that is very difficult. So the other things to think about when it comes to refundability, you can actually use it as a proactive. In fact, I've done this a number of times where I've said, particularly for initial projects that I may do with a client, perhaps we're one where it's involving primarily my time. It's relatively short and narrow in scope. And in those cases, I have offered a money back guarantee. I've never, ever had anybody take me up on a money back guarantee. Of course, now that I say that, I'm sure I'll offer that to someone in the next few weeks and it'll come back to bite me. But it's something that you can use as leverage. So sometimes offering the notion of a refund or money back guarantee actually can head off people feeling concerned about it. And really, that's the last thing that I would say here. If someone during the negotiation stage is raising your contract terms and suggesting that they want to have refundability in there, it means that they're seeing some real risk in the relationship. And so, as we say about expectations, you need to make sure they're aligned. You need to make sure you dig deeper and figure out what is their fundamental concern, what is underlying the reason that they want to have refundability in there. Is it simply because their organization has a policy that they can't pay in advance or they can't have refund-free contracts? That's true of some government agencies. They may have local or state rules that govern their contracts and say that they can't do that. Obviously, that's a clear-cut case that you're just going to have to address. But if you're an organization as a client that's asking for this and they don't have rules in place, why are they concerned? Are they not certain that they're going to get the value that you're offering them? Do they not know you well enough yet? So try to dig deeper and figure out what the underlying concern is around wanting that refundability clause in there and try to address that if possible instead of fixating on the legal language, because far too often when we negotiate contracts, we're not thinking about what the other party is actually looking for, is actually concerned about. And oftentimes there are ways that you can address those concerns without changing the specific legal language and instead relooking at the way you're providing services or the overall business terms that you're agreeing to. So, all right, let's see the next topic. So we'll talk now about office space. And as always, if you have questions, do feel free to put them in to the comments here. I'm happy to address them as we go along. And if you have thoughts on any of the topics that we've discussed so far, feel free to chime in and I'll talk about those comments at the end of this discussion as well. So this one is a question that came from somebody who wanted to talk about office space. And obviously, many of you have office leases, but you're not able to use your office space either because you're not comfortable opening or your local jurisdiction is not allowing you to be open, or perhaps your landlord is not allowing you to be open, or any number of things can be taking place that can make it so that you're not able to take advantage of your office lease. And so this person asked the question, have landlords been offering concessions? What are you doing? Are you continuing to pay your rent? Those kinds of things. And so this is obviously a challenge because none of us likes to be paying for a service or office space or anything that we are not able to use or take advantage of fully. But the reality is, given what's going on right now, there are many agencies that are in this position. And part of the answer to this question really depends upon your local area and how open or not it is, but also your individual landlord and what their circumstances are. So let me share a few examples of things that I've seen with some of my agency clients or heard from other agencies that I've talked to. The first is if you're dealing with a small individual landlord and and they're not a big company, they're not a big real estate developer or something like that. Many of those folks are in the same boat as the rest of you. They are sitting there saying, how am I going to make the mortgage on this building? Because most commercial landlords don't own their office space outright. They own their buildings through the help of a mortgage with the bank, just as most of us do with our homes. And so they need to be making those mortgage payments. And so they depend upon the office rents that they get in order to pay those bills. So if you're working with a smaller landlord who's in that circumstance, you need to try to find ways to work with them and understand that they're facing the same pressures that you are. And so if you can reach a mutual accommodation, that's going to be best. But a lot of those folks are pushing pretty hard, in my experience and what I've seen over the last few months, to try to get fully compensated for their lease payments. On the flip side, some of the larger commercial landlords, folks who own buildings across multiple cities, have tons and tons of square footage that they're leasing out. I've seen a number of them be more willing to be flexible with clients, usually in terms of pausing their rent for a few months in exchange for an extension, typically of more than the months that they're pausing for. So let's say that they let you pause for 2 or 3 months in your lease payments. They might then ask you to extend your overall lease term by 6 months or a year or more. And it sort of depends on where those agencies have been in the course of their lease. The closer that they are to the end, they may have been looking for a longer extension because perhaps that discussion was already taking place before March when all of this came to a head. So um, those types of landlords have typically been a little bit more flexible in their terms, at least in the short term, but it does come with that bigger bite over the long term. And you need to think about whether those short-term concessions are worth it, particularly if you, like many agencies, are looking at your office space needs and your remote workforce and saying, what kind of balance do I see in the future? And I think the reality is none of us really knows yet what the best solution is. So I'm encouraging agencies not to make any rash decisions in the moment about whether they're going to become exclusively remote, mostly remote, give up office space. Take some time, try to continue to get through this survival period or limbo period, whatever you want to think of it as, and make those decisions only as you start to have a little bit more visibility into the future. Because the reality is, we're only about 3 months into this new way of working. And I know it feels like more than that. It feels like 3 years, maybe 30 years in some cases, depending upon your individual situations. But please take the time to accurately assess what your best solution is for the future. To the extent that you can use your conversations with landlords to have more flexibility and to avoid long-term extensions or things that have long-term impact, you're going to be better off. And so in some cases, it may be better to bite the bullet, and if you've got the cash flow, pay your office rent now so that you have the flexibility to make a longer term decision without that extension turning into a regret. So what else have I seen from landlords? One of the things that you need to think about is whether or not you are choosing not to occupy your space because of safety concerns or concerns that your staff may have, or are you prohibited from being there? And in the cases where it was the government prohibiting you, that may be a different thing than if your landlord is prohibiting it. There are some landlords who do not feel comfortable having space open or fully open, and so they are saying to their tenants, you cannot come back just yet. If you're in one of those situations, you have a much stronger leg to stand on in working with that landlord to get them to make concessions, because it's not your choice that you are not occupying that space. It is their choice, and they are one of the parties to the agreement. So in those cases, you should try to get whatever concession that you can, and you may need to talk to your own attorney to try to figure out what leverage exists in your agreement. And every commercial lease is a little bit different, and your local circumstances are going to be a little bit different. So whether or not you can invoke some of the clauses in that agreement to get concessions, that's really going to depend upon what the written word in that document is. Now, the other thing that you should be looking at is, what is the landlord doing in terms of common space? Because particularly if you are in a larger building in a city or something like that, there are typically common spaces, restrooms, perhaps some shared kitchen facilities, meeting facilities, lobbies, elevators, all that kind of stuff. And you need to make sure that you understand what they're doing, what their rules are. Are there things that you no longer will have access to, at least in the near term, or have restricted access to? To the extent that the landlord is restricting you from using anything that is included in your lease agreement and your arrangement with them, you again may have more leverage to seek concessions. Finally, I would say this. If you are in an agency and you are having a significant financial challenge, you are having difficulty paying your rent, be honest with your landlord and go to them and say, look, this is my circumstance. You can try to get blood from a stone, but at the same time, I've only got so much cash to pay bills right now because of my own financial circumstances. And my experience is that typically, if you are open with landlords, and this goes for small local folks or large commercial organizations, if you're working with them and you're open with them, you typically can find some resolution. I know in my case, I've gotten out of a couple of commercial leases over the years by simply working with the landlord and saying, here's what I'm looking to do. I know you need to try to fill the space. Let's try to come to some sort of accommodation where I either buy my way out or I continue to pay even if I'm not using the space for a period of time, or there's all sorts of things that you can do to make it easier for your landlord to have the transition. So try to find those win-wins. But if you're in that kind of really difficult situation, please have a conversation with your landlord sooner rather than later to try to figure that out, because that's the only way that you're going to get to the accommodations that you need in order to make your business successful over the long term. All right, let's see. So, next topic that came up, this was someone who asked about employee NDAs. And this is an agency that is shifting from contractors to part-time employees or full-time employees, and that's in part because of California's AB5. And that's something I know I've talked a lot about in the past. There are all sorts of challenges being created by this AB5 legislation in California. And by the way, even if you are not based in California, if you have contractors in California, you need to be thinking about this as an agency owner, as an agency leader, because it may well apply to you. So do take a look at this. And California essentially has made it really difficult for agencies to have freelancers or contract workers who are based in that state, because the state is, they passed the law initially to try to protect Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, DoorDash folks, those kinds of things. But it was written in such a broad fashion that it really envelops a lot of other businesses, including agencies. And by the way, it affects the media too, because freelance writers are wrapped up in this. And that's a topic for another day, but particularly if you are doing outreach to media folks, this can be impacting your business as an agency as well. But if you're switching from contractors to employees, there's a whole suite of documents that you need to be thinking about. And the first thing I will say is, while there is some paperwork that needs to be done and you do need to think about these things, you shouldn't be afraid about making the switch from contractors to employees. I know when I hired my first employee 20 years ago, I was really concerned about what I was taking on as far as a workload, as far as risks. And the reality is, it's not nearly as bad as you think it is, particularly today. I mean, when I started out, we had to do our own manual filings of quarterly tax returns and those kinds of things, employment tax returns, not our own business ones. And so to do all of that was cumbersome. It was difficult. Now there are so many great payroll services out there that simplify all of this process, that makes it easy to offer benefits, whether that's retirement accounts with or without an employer match, health insurance with or without an employer share of it, all of the tax returns and filings that you need to have to be legal and legit. There are so many ways to do this so much easier today that you really shouldn't be afraid of it. The biggest difference when it comes to having employees versus contractors, I find with most agency owners, most business owners, is the concern that folks have about letting people go when things get bad. And obviously what we're going through right now means a lot of agencies have had to lay off employees, and more, I think, will be doing that in the coming months, as I've said repeatedly, particularly as Paycheck Protection Plan money runs out. And so the biggest difference is you have to be willing, just as willing as you are to shut off the spigot to a contractor, you have to be just as willing to let an employee go when the finances simply don't make sense for you as a business. And I know this is hard. I know this is painful. I have had to lay people off in the past 20 years. I hate doing it. It's not fun. Letting someone go for cause because they've done something wrong or because they're not doing their job well, that's tough enough. But when you're in a position where you're letting someone go simply because the business doesn't justify that payroll expense anymore, it's really, really difficult. But you need to be willing to do that. And that, frankly, that psychological barrier is the biggest thing that you need to overcome. But as you're bringing these former contractors on as employees, beyond working with a payroll provider like Paychex or ADP or any of the other ones that are out there, you need to be thinking about some of the other agreements that you need to have in place. And we do have some examples of these, and I'll actually, if you go to the agency leadership website and click on the resources tab, there's a library in here, and we have all sorts of free documents that you can access as examples. And it is important to understand that these are examples, but it covers pretty much all of the basics that you would have when working with employees. But they are the kinds of documents that will give you some idea of what you should be addressing in these agreements. You need to make sure that you are working with your own counsel, with your own lawyer, to make sure that it is compliant with all of your local rules and regulations, your individual circumstances. In some cases, you want to work with your accountant to make sure that they're set up properly for whatever tax structure that you have and any needs that you may have financially. But they are the kinds of things that you want to be covering. And so this particular question about NDAs, those are important. You do want to have an NDA in place with your employees so that they're protecting not just your confidential information, but the confidential information that they are receiving from your clients. And in many cases, clients may ask you to sign confidentiality agreements that cover your employees. So the best way for you to protect yourself as a business owner, as an agency owner, is to make sure that your own employees are signing similar documents. So make sure that you have those in place. Whenever you're looking at documents that employees sign, the topic of non-compete agreements come up. I am not a big fan of non-compete agreements. I like non-solicitation agreements, and we can have perhaps a separate conversation about that someday, because I know we're already deep into today's topics. But if you're thinking about a non-compete, do know that they're not enforceable in a lot of states or minimally enforceable in many places. And so non-solicitation, where someone can't go after the clients that they've been working with or that your agency has while they are with you, that's often a more powerful and more enforceable type of agreement. But so go ahead, use the documents in the resource library as a starting point to understand what you should be covering. I think you'll find some really good examples in there. Like I said, they're absolutely free to download. You do have to register on the site to do that. That will also get you an invitation, by the way, to the agency leadership Slack community, where there are good conversations that take place between and among agency owners on a regular basis. So hop in there, and it's also a good place to ask questions that I'll either answer here on a video discussion like this, or directly in the Slack channel, or perhaps both, or turn it into an article. There's lots of resources available that way. The other thing that I would say when it comes to employee agreements is to make sure that you are clearly educating your employees about these documents. So a lot of times when someone becomes an employee, they sit down on their first day and they sign document after document, and maybe you give them a copy and they stick it in a file and they don't pay any attention to it. It is important for you to make sure that as an employer, you're helping to educate your team members about what the expectations are and what those documents actually say. Because in most cases, they'll sign them without really fully appreciating it. And you need to make sure, particularly when it comes to confidentiality and non-disclosure, that you are setting the right example, and that you are explaining to them regularly, why they need to be adhering to those standards and what the risks are if they don't, particularly citing anything where a client has a specific a standard of confidentiality that you need to be enforcing. So include education along with signing actual documents. Let's see, I think we've got time for at least one more question here, so I will do that. And again, if you've got your own questions that you'd like to put in the comments, feel free to do so. So how can I be promoting my team more? Should I be having them do virtual presentations, writing blog posts for their website, or other things? And so I think this is a really powerful question. It goes along with one of the topics that Ginny, Dietrich, and I talked about on the Agency Leadership podcast very recently, which was team selling. But this is sort of using your team for overall thought leadership. And so you do want to be thinking about how you can leverage your whole team. And by the way, this goes for whether you have a team mostly of employees or mostly of contractors. It's a little bit trickier with contractors, and I'll touch on that in a minute because I was working with an agency owner on this recently as well. But you want to make sure that you are doing what you can to leverage the expertise and talent within your team to help grow your agency's profile, to help increase your credibility, and ultimately to generate more business. So, how do you do this? The first thing you need to do is you need to work with your individual team members to find out what they are comfortable with. And in my experience, different people are comfortable with different things. And I'm not talking about merely the format, right? So some people are better on video, some people are better in person, some people write better, all those kinds of things. And yes, that all matters. But you also have to look at how comfortable are they with just simply being out there, attaching their names to things. So there are some people in my experience who are uncomfortable even putting their name on a ghost written article or blog post that you may help provide for them. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're asking an employee to do something uncomfortable. You do need to be working with them to try to help them understand, why it's valuable for them to be participating and what they can do to help your agency grow and why that's valuable for them as well. And so if you work with each individual and figure out what's going to be most useful for them, I mean, really, it's about treating yourself as the client. And you would do this if you were working with a client. If you're a PR or marketing agency, you work with your clients all the time to try to figure out how you can create content for them, what their experts are comfortable with. And so it might mean that you simply interview your team members and you put together a Q&A article, or you interview them for a video and you put the video out and then maybe turn that into an article. It might be that you ask them to do a webinar, host a webinar, or to work with a partner organization to produce a webinar. Or it might be that you start a YouTube video series because you get someone who's like me who just loves looking into the camera and talking away. And by the way, speaking of the camera, I got a comment here from Albert who asked, "What camera am I using? Super quality image, either that or you are getting clearer as you get older." And I like to think, Albert, that I am really getting much better looking as I get older. I think it's the quarantine ready haircut that I've had for the last decade or so, and maybe it's just getting to spend so much quality time at home these days and less time on airplanes. But in any case, to answer your question, this camera is a Sony A6100. It is a mirrorless camera, an interchangeable lens camera, and I've got a Sigma 16 millimeter lens on it, and I believe it's a 1.4. And so it is very good quality. And for those of you who have asked, by the way, this backdrop is real. These things are all here. I can actually touch it. It is not a green screen. But in any case, so if you've got team members who are comfortable with video like I am and enjoy doing this, great. Take advantage of that. Have them participate in that fashion. If they'd rather write, take advantage of that. And you really want to make sure that you are doing things to help promote your team members for their benefit as well as for the agency. And this is one of those things that it's often difficult to get the balance just right. In some cases, agencies spend a lot of time building up an individual employee, often to have a profile larger than the agency owner, and then that becomes a problem if they decide to leave because people are associating that individual with your business. And so you do need to make sure that as the owner, as the CEO or president or other senior executive, that you are generating your own profile. You don't want to be in a situation where you are promoting someone in such a way that it's to the detriment of your own profile. You want to make sure that you're rising everybody up and that you are doing things as your team members are creating content and as they're getting their thought leadership out there, that you are helping to promote it, but that people are associating it with you and the agency. So the more that you do that, the more effective that you're going to be in putting together a thought leadership program that goes beyond just you and takes advantage of all of the assets that you have. And you really do want to make sure that all of those nooks and crannies of expertise that you have, and you have those nooks and crannies, even if you're just a 2 or 3 person agency, you don't need to be 20, 30, 100 people. You can do it with very small numbers of people, because chances are you've hired people. You've got people on your team who have expertise that is different from yours. They have perspectives that are different from yours. They have talents that are different from yours. And if you can get all of that out there, that's a massive multiplier that you can use to help grow your agency more quickly, that you can use to help show prospective clients, even existing clients, all of that expertise and talent that you have and why they should be working with you. So absolutely find ways to work with your individual team members, customize it so that it works for what your agency needs as well as what that individual needs, and do what you can to help uplift those team members at the same time that you're uplifting the agency. So hopefully that helps. Let's see, Albert has followed up here. Super good point about being out there. I work for a major big brand, but I don't want to be out there for them because it's a no-win. Someone could just want to grind an axe, or there are too many trolls out there these days. Yeah, and so, again, it does depend upon what your own comfort level is, what your team members' comfort level is. And so you do need to make sure that you're completely in tune there. And it doesn't make any sense to put someone in an uncomfortable position, because then you're compromising everything else that they're doing on behalf of your agency. So don't force people to do something that they are not comfortable with. It's a mistake, honestly, that I've made over the last 20 years, and I'm doing my best to avoid it these days. And hopefully in the rest of my career, I will not make that same mistake again. But who knows? Not all of us learn from our mistakes. What can I say? All right, so that will bring us to an end of the topics that we have for today. Hopefully you've gotten a lot of value out of this discussion. If you have additional feedback that for any of the things that I've talked about, or additional questions you'd like to see me cover in a future Free-for-All Friday, or on a separate video, or in a blog post, whatever, feel free, just drop me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com. I always love to hear from you. If you've enjoyed this video, please, if you're on YouTube, click subscribe, click the notification icon. If you're on Facebook or YouTube or anywhere else, click like, because I always appreciate seeing that someone has enjoyed the content that we are creating. And we will be back with you on Monday. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make an exception here and jump in, because my friend Henry has a question that I think actually fits very well here. And this is, how do you prioritize marketing over client work? So forget the wrap up that I was just doing. And this is why you need to listen to me till the very end, because you just never know when I'm going to go flying off on a tangent. And so this is a great tangent, Henry. So appreciate you bringing it up. And so this is a challenge for every agency. We are always prepared to put marketing our own business to the side to do client work. And there's no doubt you need to focus on client work first and foremost, because they are paying the bills. And if you do not service your clients appropriately, they will not continue to pay your bills, and well, that's bad for you. But you do need to be thinking about how you set aside an appropriate amount of time for marketing. And so how do you figure out what's appropriate, and how do you fence it off? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to set up your agency as a client of itself. And one of the things that I did a number of years ago at one of the agencies I worked at was I literally set up the agency as a client team. And we set it up in the same way that we would work for pretty much any other client, where we had representatives of the different skill sets that we had within the business. And we put together a team and said, okay, how can we help grow the business? And you need to, as an owner, as a leader, make sure that you are making clear to your team that while clients come first, they do need to set aside this time. And part of that comes from making sure that you're not dramatically over-servicing your existing clients, right? That's one of the challenges. We will often find ways to continue to do work for clients even when we've gone above and beyond what the expectations are, what the requirements of our statement of work might be, and those kinds of things. So you need to fence off the over-servicing, and that will help on the marketing side. But the other is you need to set clear objectives. And so you need to meet with this client as this agency as a client team, and set down actual timelines and deadlines, just like you would for client work. You need to say, this is what we want to accomplish. We want to try to, we want to get out 3 blog posts this month, and 2 videos, and send out weekly email newsletters or whatever it is, and you need to hold yourself and your team accountable for those metrics. And if you find that you don't have the time to do that, then you need to decide to consciously adjust your standards, your metrics, and say, okay, this is not feasible for us. We thought we could do this within a reasonable amount of effort, but we can't. Or you can sit there and say, well, wait a minute, if we're not spending nearly enough on marketing in order to generate the leads that we need and close the new business that we need in order to continue to grow. And so the way you figure that out is by looking at, what are your standards? How many new clients do you need to have? How much new business do you need to generate on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis? What do you need to do from a marketing perspective to generate the leads that you need in order to close that business? And if it's just like working with your clients. If you don't have the efforts at the top of the funnel, you're not going to get the results from the bottom of the funnel. So you need to be realistic about that. At the same time, you don't want to overinvest in marketing, right? If you're generating more leads than you can handle or convert, what's the point of that? So really, if you treat yourself as a client and you look at the activities that you're undertaking in the same way that you would for your client, you'll be able to set these metrics and goals pretty well. And if you can't do that, if you're having trouble doing that, then that may be a time to work with an outside agency or an outside consultant who can help you with those things, because they can take a more objective view and they can help hold you accountable. And I know plenty of agencies who hire other agencies to help promote them, help market them. And so if you can't solve it in-house, either because you don't have the time or the skill to do it, then you need to be investing in the outside resources in whatever form they take in order to accomplish those objectives. So, Henry, thank you for that question. Hopefully that helped to answer it a bit. And with that, we will draw this to a close. Again, chip@agencyleadership.com. If you've got follow-up questions, visit agencyleadership.tv for all of our past videos and presentations to take a look at. And with that, have a great weekend. I look forward to seeing you back here next week.